In this video, we're going to look at the three different mesh types that exist in 3DCoat. They are associated with the three primary workspaces: Paint, Retopo, and Sculpt. The Tweak Room and the UV Room are companion workspaces to the Paint workspace in the sense that they work exclusively on paint objects. What is a paint object? It's a model that is imported directly into the Paint workspace, either through the File menu or through the splash screen, or if you're coming from the Retopo workspace. Typically, it's low polygon in nature and it has UV maps. A Retopo mesh is something that you either build from scratch in this workspace, or it can also be a low polygon model that you import from outside of 3DCoat. And you can use this as your low polygon target mesh. So after you've done any sculpting in the Sculpt workspace, you can bake everything down to this particular mesh. I would always suggest that if you're coming from outside of 3DCoat bringing a model in, to start here first. Go to the Import tool, or from the splash screen, you can choose Retopo, but go here when you have any one of these tools selected in these two sections. If you go to Mark Seams, all your UV tools will open up to you. They are a mirrored set of UV tools that you have in the UV workspace, but they are dedicated strictly for Retopo. The UV workspace is strictly for paint objects that reside in the Paint workspace. So, getting back to the UV tools, you won't see the import option here because, again, these are assuming that you want to use the UV tools. But once you choose any tool from the top two sections, you'll notice the import tool is available. You can also go straight to the Retopo menu and choose it here. So import your model in, and once you hit apply or the enter key to commit it to this workspace, it may ask you if you want to snap it to an underlying model. In such a case, you would not, because you don't have an underlying voxel object yet. Once you have your low polygon mesh and you want to do some sculpting, then go to the geometry menu and choose Retopo mesh to Sculpt mesh. Let's zoom in and look at our model. What I did here is I used the Reduce tool. This is surface mode, and you can see that indicated on your Vox tree layer with an S next to it. If I click that, it's going to switch to voxel mode, and voxels are entirely different. I mean, it's a completely different paradigm for sculpting, because you literally are sculpting or manipulating volumetric pixels in space. What you see is an adaptive outer mesh. It's much like visual effects tools in an application like Houdini or Maya. They all have a voxel grid, and the denser the grid, the more resolution you're going to get for your simulations, but obviously it will take a little bit longer. So you can think in those terms when you're working with voxels in 3DCoat. It's also very similar to working in Photoshop when you're working with documents. If you start with a very large document, you already are starting with quite a bit of resolution for most tasks. However, if you have to start with a smaller document, like a letter size or smaller, then to get a higher degree of resolution, you would need to increase the dots per inch in Photoshop. In 3DCoat, when you click increase resolution on your layer, whether it's empty or whether it has an object on it, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to assign more voxels per grid. What you're seeing is an outer adaptive mesh that conforms to whatever changes you make to the volume. So let me hide the voxel object. And again, we're looking at a surface mode object. You have a lot of tools that will dynamically subdivide or dynamically reduce the polygonal density of your model in a localized fashion or in a global fashion, meaning to the whole model. Let's say, for example, I can use live clay to sculpt and, let me choose a different brush here, to both sculpt and tessellate. As I reduce my brush size, it's going to tessellate more. Typically, when you're working with very small brush sizes, you're working with things like wrinkles and just very small details. And so it's going to be subdivided much more, as you can see. Let's right-click and drag up to increase our brush size. Right-click and drag down to decrease it. So if I decrease it all the way to 0, and I can see it reflected here, then what it's going to do is just tessellate and nothing else. We have options here in the toolbar so that when you are smoothing, you can choose these different options that all have some relation to smoothing. Anti-bump is really good for general purpose smoothing because it's very subtle. It just tries to remove small surface irregularities without changing the overall surface contour. Powerful smoothing will somewhat decimate, so if you get any small errors, it's a good option to turn to first. In fact, I'll go ahead and choose that now, and I'll hold down the Shift key, and you can see what it's doing. We have relax, but the point I do want to get across here is we have the ability to tessellate just like we would with live clay brushes, but we can do it on the fly while we're working with other tools. So let's say if I'm using the clay brush, but I realize I want some tessellation, instead of me having to switch brushes, I can choose add detail or extra detail as one of my options in the Shift or Control Shift key menus. They're both tessellation, but this one's just a higher degree. Now when I hold the Control Shift key and brush, I'm able to tessellate in areas that I think I'm going to need it. I'll do it again. Now you can see the impracticality of using the same base mesh throughout your workflow. It's being converted to either voxels or a triangulated mesh involving dynamic tessellation. If you're coming from another sculpting application that has recently adopted dynamic tessellation, they also have to convert the model into an entirely different mesh. You lose whatever sculpt layers you may have, you lose any subdivision levels that you may have whenever you make these drastic changes. It's because it changes the topology so dramatically that you just cannot maintain the original low polygon mesh. Okay. Now you can always bake it down to your original mesh, and that's what we would do later on once we're done with our sculpting. Another interesting element to working with sculpt objects is that you have Pbr shaders to use for more accurate pre-visualization. You can use them as a base for texturing, so when you go to baking, you'll get a very accurate representation of what the Pbr shader looks like. For example, if I switch to a copper Pbr shader and I bake this out, it's going to look exactly like this after the bake.